Hey everyone, this is Miss Valentine, and you are watching the Environmental Impacts, Population, and Sustainability Notes Part 2. We're going to continue where we left off on Monday. So this slide here is talking about the IPAP model of environmental impact. And this is a formula to look at how much of an impact something has or a population has on the environment. It's essentially an ecological footprint formula, if you want to think of it that way. So what it means is that the ecological or environmental impact of a population, I, is equal to the population itself, so that's the population size specifically, times the consumption per person, and that actually is just related to A or affluence. Affluence is wealth, so countries that are more wealthy, developed countries especially, consume more resources. So the consumption per person is considered affluence, or A. And then the other factor that determines the environmental impact is the technological impact. So technology requires environmental resources. Think of the Industrial Revolution requiring coal and other fossil fuels to make energy and other resources. So technology can be harmful, but technology can also be useful. You can make things more efficient. So technology impact could be a negative or a positive impact. But all of those things together, the population, the affluence, and the technology, go into the ecological footprint of a population, or the environmental impact, or I. So let's take a look here at a picture that is showing how two different countries could have the same exact ecological footprint or environmental impact, even if they have a different number of people. So in developing countries, you tend to have more people, the population is larger, but they don't use as many resources because they are not as affluent, they're not as wealthy. And then the environmental impact that they have, because they're not using those resources, that technology is not as impactful on the overall footprint. It's their number of people is the big factor. In developed countries, you see smaller population size, but they consume a lot more resources, and the technology can be more wasteful. Developed countries also have the potential to create a much smaller, these two bubbles make them much smaller if we spend the resources to do so. But we tend to have larger ecological footprints in developed countries like the US because of our resource use and our technology, if we use more wasteful technology. So this just shows you that ecological footprints are not completely straightforward. Environmental impact of a population is not completely straightforward. It depends on those three factors and how big they are. So here is a pit stop here. You can pause the video to answer this question and then click the play button when you're ready to move on. Sustainability is defined as the ability of a system to survive and function over time. And ultimately, having an environmentally sustainable society would mean that we would live off of our natural income. We would be able to sustain our population without degrading what we have on the earth. For the last several centuries, we have been exceeding and degrading, depleting our resources, and we're starting to suffer the consequences of those. So sustainability is becoming a major issue because we are starting to have to pay the costs of not living sustainably. Looking at an environmentally sustainable society means looking to provide the needs of current and future generations. I learned about a concept of thinking of yourself as an ancestor. This is something I learned this summer. So think of yourself as being a good ancestor. Are you being a good ancestor to future generations? Most of us here in the US, we really only think maybe 1 or 2 generations ahead. We think of maybe our children and grandchildren. Some people don't even think of that. When there are a lot of cultures where they think of at least 7 generations in the future, and they think of their impact as an ancestor to those future generations. Are you being a good ancestor to those future generations? That is, I think, a really cool way to think about it, and think about, are we living in a way that is sustainable, that can provide for those future generations? So that's ultimately the goal of this class, is to learn about how we can become more sustainable. But I think it's something that our society as a whole is going to need to learn a whole lot more about moving forward, as we start to see the consequences of living unsustainably. So in your textbook, there are only 3 principles of sustainability that are mentioned, but I have this additional 4th one here, that I also think is important. Your textbook mentions solar energy as part of sustainability. Solar energy is constantly being replenished. There's tons of it. If we can learn to harness it and capture it, we don't really need outside things like fossil fuels and that sort of thing. Biodiversity is also something that you need as part of sustainability. It prevents ecosystem collapse. It makes ecosystems more durable. If you think about biology, even just having genetic diversity within a single species is beneficial to the survival of that species. And in that same way, biodiversity helps to maintain ecosystems on Earth. It strengthens their ability to survive and continue on. Nutrient recycling is basically just reusing what we have on the earth. This is carbon cycle, oxygen cycle, nitrogen cycle, phosphorus cycle. As humans, we aren't super good at recycling our nutrients. We put everything in a landfill. And at some point, some of those nutrients, some of those materials that we have in the landfill are not going to be available out in the environment anymore. We're going to have to go into those landfills and mine them for materials. But allowing nutrients to recycle in a way that replenishes other parts of the ecosystem, that's an essential part of sustainability as well. And then this 4th one that isn't mentioned in your textbook is population control, which we often think of in terms of humans, like we should control the population size of the human species. But what this is referring to is just the natural ebb and flow of populations, predators and prey, keeping one another in check, making sure that the ecosystem has the resources to support the living organisms in them that are there. So that's something that naturally occurs in a sustainable system. So our path to sustainability really requires science. And right now, I think if we were to predict what history books might say about 2020 and our attitude towards science, there's a lot of misinformation and a lot of mistrust for science right now. So for us to achieve sustainability, we really need to make sure that sound science is being used, and that the public trusts science and understands that it is essential to our survival as a species. So sound science is super important when it comes to sustainability. But it's not just the environment that we look at in environmental science, because economics plays a huge role. And in our podcast this week on can corporations fix climate change, I think is the name of the title, you'll see that economics plays an enormous role, especially in developed countries like the US. Morality and values and ethics, those are all things that we often like to, if you're environmentally minded, you often like to attack people about their morality or their values if they aren't very environmentally minded. But that is not a very effective way of changing people's opinions about environmentalism and about sustainability. That's probably like the worst way to go. So we'll talk more about that and how that plays a role, how we change our societal values in a productive way. Technology is a very, very hopeful area. That's one of the ways that I maintain hope in humanity, is that we'll develop some technologies to help us to deal with some of the problems that we have. But it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to prevent a lot of the environmental degradation that we do have. And then psychology is another area of importance, that it's kind of understanding why people like me know all about climate change. I know how to cut my energy costs, but I still turn my thermostat to 70 degrees because I'm hot. How does the psychology work when you have someone who understands and knows the damage but continues to do the things that they do anyway? It's something that all of us kind of struggle with. And so that's the psychology end of understanding sustainability. Now these 2 graphs, one of them, the one on the right, you are going to do a little research project with that in just a minute, so you'll get to look at that. But I encourage you to take a look at the graph on the left, or the table on the left. Principles of sustainability really are based on nature and how nature works. So if we would look to nature as a teacher, to base our systems on, we actually would create more of a sustainable society. So I encourage you to read through that, take a few minutes to read through that. It's on your notes paper. And it's just showing that we can do a whole lot better if we understand how nature works and try to mimic that. Um, Humans have oftentimes for generations and generations, centuries and centuries, we have often seen ourselves as above nature or outside of nature, but really we are a part of nature. And if we were to create our own systems to reflect nature, our species will survive a great deal longer. So this final graph here on the current emphasis of our society to the sustainability emphasis, this is where I want you to do a little bit more research. Over the course of the year, I want you to kind of explore like, okay, what careers or what people actually do this kind of job? Because in some way you might want to add a sustainability minor to your college degree, or you may want to pursue a career in one of these areas. So throughout the year, I'm going to try and incorporate that into our notes and our activities. So for this specific one, for each of these areas of emphasis, I want you to explain who is responsible for making more sustainable changes in the US. So focus on the US for now. So like in terms of going from just cleaning up pollution to preventing pollution, making cleaner production, who are some of the people, what are some of the careers that are responsible for doing those sorts of things? Or you could talk about organizations as well. So the Environmental Protection Agency is a very powerful force in the country. Well, maybe not right at this moment, but it can be in doing a lot of these things. But what specific organizations, even aside from the Environmental Protection Agency, are involved in going from this current emphasis that we have to a more sustainable emphasis? So you guys are going to use the internet to find answers for this and respond with complete sentences at the end of your notes packet. Now for our work session on Thursday, if you'd like to do some small breakout groups and work on this with others, you are welcome to do that. I would open up the breakout groups and then you can just put yourself in groups if you want to work on it together, or you can go ahead and do this on your own. But when you finish your 7 sentences, at least 7 sentences, you can submit your Google Doc on Schoology. And that's all I have for you for this chapter. Make sure you're doing your reading as well and your Aplia homework before you do the quiz, because in the case of all of the notes that I do, they're only going to hit some highlights of the chapter. There are other details that you will need to look at as well. I will see you guys next time.